From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
And hi again. Welcome to Chicago Newsroom. Well, okay, it's probably a completely bogus survey designed more as clickbait than insightful research, but the facts are the facts. CareerCast announced this week that newspaper reporter has fallen to the very bottom, number 200 on its list of desirable American jobs. Less desirable than lumberjacking at 199. But wait, there's more. Also in the bottom 25, broadcaster. That's supposed to be like people who prepare and read the news. And a personal tragedy to me, disc jockey at 179. I mean, I always wanted to be an AM disc jockey. That was the thing I wanted most of all. Anyway, it's probably all just junk science, but the American people have also proclaimed in another survey this week that they were pretty satisfied with media coverage of Boston. 32% excellent and 40% good. So what does it all mean? What is the media these days? Is it Wolf Blitzer, Maureen Dowd, Infowars.com? Well, you know what? Maybe the Boston police are the media. That Twitter link to their scanners made every cop a broadcaster in those wee hours of Thursday night. We're going to talk to somebody who stayed up all night listening to it. In fact, an officer may have thought he was talking to dispatch, but 50,000 voyeurs were listening in all over the world. And that's what we're going to try to tackle today, the media. We have become accustomed to the terms old and new media, but do they still apply? They've both been out there in force for this past week, and we're going to find out what were the high points, the low points, and everything in between with Barbara Iverson from Columbia College, Journalism Department. So glad to have you back on the show again, Barb. Thank you. And also our old friend Marcus Gilmer from Sun-Times, a digital editor at the Chicago Sun-Times, and happy to have you here. And happy that you've actually chosen to use the picture of the last time you were on the show as your Facebook.
It's the most flattering thing I could find.
Yeah. All right. So there is some local news going on this week, but to be honest, there's not that much going on, and I thought it would. I mean, there's not that much going on that we have to really get right on top of it. I thought this would be a perfect time to sort of take a breath and bring in a couple of people who really are deeply involved in media to talk about where we're at and where we are going. And I think there's no better place to start, Marcus, than the thing you wrote about having stayed up all night listening to those scanners in Boston. And to ask you the question of whether was that news? Was that media? What was it? Explain what it was, first of all. What were you doing?
Well, right after the report of the MIT officer being shot and killed on the campus there in Boston, I think there was a little bit of buzz, like after the bombings earlier in the week. I think there was a little bit of buzz, like whether or not this could have been connected. And of course, at the time, the news outlets were very careful to not draw conclusions in terms of tying the two together. Mm-hmm. But people were tuned in nonetheless because it piqued people's interest given everything that was going on there. It was a very violent thing that happened. And then, it was one of those phenomena that just took off. It was the true definition of viral, like this scanner link, because people were starting to hear bits of information that maybe indicated that they were tied together, and that link started going around. And I do want to point out that besides the scanner, another very popular source for folks was the live video streams of several of the local affiliates in Boston. As much as we can take, and we will, I'm assuming, take some of the mainstream news networks to task for everything they did wrong, the local affiliates did things right. And so that's what I was filtering all night long, was not only the police scanner, but the ABC affiliate, the NBC affiliate, the CB, all of the local affiliates there were just top notch in their reporting. They really put the national networks to shame. And so this scanner goes viral, and people are sharing everything that they hear on the scanner. I think, I would call it a sharing of information. I don't know if that really falls into, the traditional term of journalism or media. I think this was another moment, along with Hurricane Sandy and previous events before that have really turned a corner in the way that we view, or at least smart users view, Twitter. I don't think CNN would know it if it came up and tapped them on the shoulder, it seems sometimes, but the way they ignore it. But it's it's a sharing of information, and you have to view it with a grain of salt. I think smart users do. I think people who have worked in a newsroom know that you can't take every single thing you hear on a scanner, you know, as the gospel, because, and especially when you're a police officer calling this dispatch and you're chasing these two guys who are throwing homemade bombs and firing semi-automatic weapons at you. You talk about confusion to the nth degree. So you had to take it all with a grain of salt. And I think that the self-correction course that social media can take is also another thing that's turned a corner. People will take you to task on Twitter, and I think we see just as much criticism of media on Twitter as we do elsewhere. And I think we're getting there. It's still not perfect by any means, but the way that information was shared and shared quickly, people are hungry for information. It took half an hour to 45 minutes for these national news networks to pick up what was happening Thursday night.
When you say getting there, that's the thing that I want to get to, is where is there that we're trying to get to.
Well, I've been thinking that one of the things that technology has been doing for journalism as we knew it is disintermediating it. So if you think about the things that journalism does, there's like the eyewitness and the the people, feet on the ground, as we say. Then there's distribution. And then there's like the part that used to be part and parcel of that was like the verification, accuracy, seeing if it's balanced. So now those can be all separate. They're, and they can occur in any order, where they used to have to occur more or less like distribution would be the last step. So you'd have everything done. So I think like with the Twitter, the scanners, you're right, journalists would know, well, the police scanner, the police don't know what's happening. Even the guy on the scene, he's just there, and it's an exciting time.
I'm sorry to interrupt. This is really interesting. So you're saying distribution can happen before the editing process.
I think that's exactly what happens.
That's
and
what we're seeing.
And I think smart users or people that are used to using these channels understand that, and they might stop and say, "Oh, I heard that. Let me see if it's anywhere else on the internet." Because
we're getting smarter too. I think regular users are getting smarter as well, and this is another example of that.
Because I checked with my college students, and how did you find out about this? Twitter. And then what did you do? So we had a lot of them said, well, then I went to the New York Times site, or they looked on Google to see if there were 3 or 4 sites. There was the student who said, I call my mother because she watches television all the time. So that's kind of a hybrid blend.
So I'll watch TV so you don't have to, kind of thing?
Or the mother's always glued to the TV. And that, I think, if you're in a traditional journalism business, like they just haven't digested all that, and they haven't pulled it all together in a way.
There were some, I think, Pete Williams at NBC particularly was excellent in terms of, and I think NBC as a whole really probably walked that line the best, even though you're always talking about the instantaneous sharing of information online on Twitter. Nowadays you're always going to be behind, especially if you are bothering to go through that verification process as a mainstream outlet. But I think the way NBC kind of couched things at times, and and just Pete Williams' information, and Pete Williams wasn't even in Boston. He was working his sources from Washington, his Justice Department sources, far and away far better than CNN. But again, I think one thing I think has been overlooked was the way the local affiliates were kind of.
I think that's really key, and it also ties into everything else we're saying, because what we're talking about is conventional media, but local conventional media. And I have one of these little internet radio things, and I was just glued to listening to WBUR in Boston. I mean, as good a job as I thought NPR was doing, BUR in many ways was doing a better job, just because it's so cool to be listening to people who all know where these places are, so you don't have to have everything explained to you all the time. It's just sort of like, well, but that's only 2 blocks away from the,
Wasn't that John King's downfall, though? One of the stories I heard was he was well connected in Boston and had a lot of sources, and so he had a source that he really trusted, the way we would trust him in the old days. But there's that break now where the feds or the larger
now you're on to
and take over from the police.
Those local sources are always going to have better sources, and I believe King is maybe from Boston. I think he grew up in Boston, so I can see why he was. I can understand his trust. But I think those local guys, those are the guys who have to call police affairs every day and build up the relationships with those officers and with those media.
You got a problem watching at home because you got 3 really passionate, talkative people here, and we're gonna I don't care. We're just gonna talk over each other. So you have to sort it out. It's just like Twitter. You're just gonna have to sort it out. Be intelligent.
I'm gonna have to retweet you in a minute.
Right. Yeah. So the real question that comes out of this then is this thing about. Marcus says, and I kind of agree with him, that in the new world you have to be an intelligent listener, not just a passive or consumer, not just a passive consumer like just sitting watching TV. You got to figure out, I wonder if that's real, I wonder if that's true. So what does that mean for what we've always called mainstream media? Is it okay that that a very good, a really decent reporter on CNN, working his sources, using all of the proper channels, just got something wrong? He made a mistake. He's been vilified for this as though he was some kind of criminal for doing this. But if he did that on Twitter, it would just be sort of like, well, that's the nature of it. It's breaking news. So can we now start applying some of that to the old?
I'm going to disagree with you really quick, because having been someone who has tweeted information that proved not to be correct before, the course correction on Twitter, people will call you out. And that's where a lot of the criticism of John King came in the play, was on Twitter. And Twitter's wrong, but when you're wrong on Twitter, people will call you out. That's the democratization of the forum. And I'll also point out, this was a pattern with CNN, not so much King himself, but this was yet another example of CNN getting information wrong.
I used a bad example because I think we all agree that CNN has a pathology that is separate from everything else. But okay, let's just say that well, a newspaper's not a good example, but a radio station or a TV station put something out there that was just factually wrong, and it stayed out there for 10 minutes, and then they said, we just realized the thing we just told you is wrong. 10 years ago, 5 years ago, that would have been like you could lose your journalism license for that, right? But today, I'm not so sure that that's such a big crime anymore, because we live in this world where everything
can be corrected.
Is correctable almost immediately.
But I think some of the trouble with this is that TV, I don't think a person standing up for hours and hours can't compete anymore with these sources like Twitter. If you worked with Twitter, you can't be like, I can't be talking to you and checking my Twitter feeds at the same time. Right. And so I think that the networks need to readjust and maybe go, say like, if you want to follow us on a Twitter channel, and right now we're going to go back to, we're going to do some backgrounding or something. And there's too much push for them to be up there. And I think people are frustrated by that, because you can't react to their mistakes quickly. On Twitter, I can get on, I can feel, justified, like, okay, I'm going to tell him right now he made a mistake.
But there is a place for both these things, though, right? I mean, aren't they learning, I think, learning incredibly from one another? No.
But I don't know that they have to be on every second. I mean, sometimes they could take a pause and they could say, we have to, if you want the constant stream, go over here to this internet channel, and we have to do some analysis, and we'll come back in 20 minutes with analysis.
There's nothing worse than a bunch of uninformed anchors standing around talking uninformedly.
Right, and what's to keep one of these, maybe they have already done this, what's to keep CNN from hiring, a 23-year-old grad student from journalism school as an intern, or even as a part-time job, who during certain hours can sit there, and that is their job, is to monitor Twitter and feeding it to a producer who can feed it to an anchor. Because
in fairness to CNN and all the networks, I think that they have hired many, many, many of these people over the last.
But there's a disconnect somewhere.
I don't think they necessarily put them in as a producer. There's a show on Al Jazeera where there's like a internet producer and an interviewer, and they are both very skilled at what they do, but they work together
which is the stuff that you're teaching. I mean, Columbia and other schools are teaching that.
I hope so.
I know that we've had some interesting conversations with the journalism school administrators who've said that there's more interest in journalism among younger people today than there was even 20 or 30 years ago, and it's because people see this as a brave new world to get into, because this thing is so it's so lagging behind where the technology is leading it, and it needs this integration, and it needs younger minds in order for that to happen.
And that survey where you had broadcast and DJ and newspaper reporter, I think young people that, you know, those are like, I mean, I asked my entire class, there wasn't a single person that found out about the thing from television or from the newspaper. They all found out. So they would want to do something with video, but it wouldn't be broadcast, or they want to, you know, do podcasts. So,
but I did always want to be an AM disc jockey, you know.
And
Marking the mark, 61 swinging degrees, clapping about the music. But I never got the chance.
The big networks have the commercial pressure too, which, I mean, Twitter and that right now doesn't necessarily have an economic model, but it's more like a watchdog. If you have a guy who came from an entertainment, you know, background, you know, pushing you to, you know, get out there, you know, break the news. I mean, CNN had a lot of viewers from that, but that's the risk. They're like walking.
But I still see this as being kind of like a, I don't really know what the analogy is, but you have the sort of the energetic, less controlled force that's pulling in one direction, and the less energetic, maybe it's the Senate and the House, right? The slower, more deliberative body, and there's really a place for both of them. They both actually sharpen one another in a really weird way. I was mentioning before that I thought it was really interesting to contrast Boston with Hurricane Sandy, because in Hurricane Sandy, we really saw social media just kick old media out of the picture completely, in my opinion. I mean, you really did have. I think that when the history of this is written, you'll see that the coverage of Sandy was sort of like the end of an era in broadcast television, where they still had the guys hanging off the lampposts and saying, "Yes, Wolf, it's really windy out here." They didn't have a clue what was going on, but that was the model. That's the playbook. That's how you cover a big storm. But then you go to Twitter and it's alight with people who are standing in their basement, who are telling you what's really going on from the ground level that the helicopter view can't possibly give you. So we need both.
And Twitter is, you know, people, I don't think a lot of people have realized the importance of like the geolocation of Twitter. And so sometimes they're looking at Twitter like it's TV, like, oh, this is just coming, and they're all the same. But within Twitter, a news organization can say, I only want Twitters within 5 centimeters of where I am, or 10 centimeters.
Not centimeters. That would be really close. That would be my back pocket.
But you know, like miles or whatever. And you know, I was thinking about that with the Boston. There's some stuff that I didn't have any particular close friends in Boston, so I had a more general interest than if I had, and it would have been fine for me to getting a larger view, and I didn't need those nano updates where my daughter was in New York, you know, in 9/11, and there I would have loved to have like the stuff from the block she was on, and that I think that could be supplied. Again, it could be, you know, they could put up URLs where you find those tracks, or they could have them on their sites, and they could.
The list feature on Twitter was really, I think, an advantage, because there were several people who put together a very good list of journalists in Boston who were for the TV stations, for the Boston Globe in particular, who also did an excellent job. Just Twitter list where you could follow just on whatever Twitter app you're using. I use TweetDeck, so it has multiple columns. So I had this straight feed of just everyone I follow in one column, and then in another column I was able to set up a couple of these lists of just Boston journalists, people who were on the scene.
Temp connection.
Yeah, and it was really interesting seeing what they were saying versus what was coming over the scanner versus what was going on, you know, being circulated in there. And so the ability to drill down, the information is there, and obviously it's still got a long way to go before we can really use it as a medium that can be 100% trusted. But if 100% trust is anything that you can ever reach anymore.
Do you think that I don't know, maybe I'm getting a little hung up on this, but is it really a public service to be linking to and broadcasting the police scanner? I mean,
it's funny because, you know, the police asked Twitter users to stop tweeting,
and they
because
did. I think
they did, and people started shouting down other people on Twitter who did because it was giving away tactical locations and misinformation, and so. And that's another great example of the community aspect of Twitter.
Right.
Yeah. And there's a Brit who he's not a military person, but he's been looking at I think Syrian aircraft aircraft, and he identifies it from pictures and things, and he's become an expert. So, you know, by the same token, you could have local experts that would, you know, go through Twitter pictures in Boston or something.
See, I guess this is another one of these really great cases where you can really see stark examples on both sides. On the one hand, I could imagine a bunch of you know, paramilitary, militant survivalist types saying, "Oh my God, the Boston Police Department's in trouble. Let's go down there. We know exactly where this is. Let's, you know, let's arm up and go down there and help out," which would have been.
They were only in the virtual with
Reddit,
right.
The
Reddit.
That's right. But Reddit was doing it virtually. On the other hand, by the time the kid was in the boat, you had, and I happened to I just by accident happened to turn on ABC and was watching ABC, and I thought they did a really good job of local sourcing that with people who citizens. They were calling them citizen journalists. They put the character generator on the bottom. They were CGing them as citizen journalists. They had their names. They had kind of vetted them a little bit, and these folks were sticking their iPhones out their window and giving them live coverage. It was cool. It was really cool. So. It's like everything else. It has this good side and bad side, and they both kind of present themselves to you at the same time.
It's just another step of that wall coming down between the readers and the journalists. You've seen it with the emergence of blogs and the internet interaction.
Right.
It's what comment sections are. This is what responding to reporters on Twitter are. You no longer do you have to write like I'm sure my dad has plenty of times, a 20-page rant in a letter and send it to the newspaper office and hope it makes the cut. Oh, he's writing one to my paper right now, I'm sure, from Alabama. But but instead there's that wall, and people don't. That wall is down. You can't put it back up. And now the users on the other side are coming over the remains of that wall, and it's. You know, some of these sources some of these media outlets are welcoming and trying to do what they can, while others just seem to completely not know what to do with it or how to use these tools.
In Korea, about 5 years ago, there was this candlelight vigil, and they were having political demonstrations, and there were a bunch of young people with video cameras who were filming all the politicians. And someone asked them if they were journalists, and they all said, "No, no, we're not journalists. We just want to capture what's happening." And then the journalists will look
journal
at it.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think sometimes we see that. You know, Korea's a little bit ahead of us in technology, and I think we're approaching that age where everybody will mature a little bit and say, "Oh yeah, like we need that eyewitness, but that doesn't have to be the same person that's balancing it, verifying it, making sure it's accurate."
So
Someone else can do that.
It's been slid down a little bit. Instead of there being a room full of people who are making these decisions, it's kind of become more democratized, and you get to make your own decisions, which is something that's hard for some of us to deal with, but it's real.
In the aftermath of the bombings, you know, a week ago this past Monday, when they happened, the first images we got were from Twitter users that the networks were able to pull and use, and you know, I'm sure we're and I know for a fact, you know, we're heading down that road. You know, what are the rights to these pictures on Twitter? You know, like do you have to get used? But that was those were the first images that we had because with phones now there was so much information. There were so many images and videos that just happened to capture the moment. We saw how many people just happened to capture the suspects on their own photos, and you know, after they released the identity of the suspects, you know, those first pictures, people started looking at their own photos and going, "Oh wow, that's that guy right here." It
was really amazing to hear the police officials actually come out and say, "We know there's 4 or 5 terabytes of data all within that, and I want it."
I would have liked to see the room where they analyze that, because I was wondering, is that like hundreds of humans analyzing it, or is it 3 computer machines?
I just saw something the other day about how the New York has software now where they're actually analyzing poll cameras. So the camera is stationary, and they can see the kind of movement that happens. So if somebody comes and puts something down and they leave, the screen goes red immediately, and you know.
Scientific American had one about sentiment, that they're looking at the faces in crowds and are people high-fiving. And then this is so Minority Report. It's like they would predict if there's going to be a crime. Look at those people. They're not high-fiving, and everyone else is. They must be ready to do something bad.
You are one of the most fearless people I've ever met. You do not fear the future. But does that give you a little bit of a creepy feeling?
Well, I would hope that I would know how to hide my real identity if I need to.
I would hope
mean,
that,
as long
I
as,
would hope
as
that
there's
I'm
a-
like already buried in the ground
Yeah,
when that
it's-
becomes reality, because I don't want to be around when that stuff is happening. I really know. That's going to be your problem,
Yeah.
Marcus.
Oh, thanks.
So yeah,
Thanks. Thanks a lot.
So you must be having these conversations. You work for a newspaper that I happen to like a lot, the Chicago Sun-Times. But oh my God, it's just this was such a perfect example of by the time the Dead Tree edition has hit the streets, 24, 28 hours have passed, and you just skip right over the story about that because you know that you already know everything that's in there.
And I think we've seen a lot of examples, not just with Boston, but the way that Twitter can share information so quickly. Several weeks ago when Roger Ebert passed away, very sadly, very sad day in the newsroom, I happened to be the guy who sent the tweet that announced to the world this great legend had passed. And that was a very neat moment. As sad as it was, that was a very neat moment, and one I think, we talk about the way Barbara has, embraced technology. Roger was the same way, and I think Roger would have gotten a kick out of this is how the world learned.
Right,
and we've got these bank of TVs, and we're looking up there, and CNN and MSNBC are starting, breaking news according to Chicago Sun-Times Twitter page. Roger Ebert has died, and so many people learned about it, and so. That first of all, we had it very well sourced from his family, so that was something we didn't get wrong, thankfully. But it shows just the power and the speed with which that the information can get out, and the speed with which it's shared. Because by that evening,
it's dramatic.
It's dramatic, and people are almost instantaneously sharing their memories on Twitter, and it became a really communal thing. That newspaper, just this one direction thing. You read, you take it all in. But then on Twitter there was a virtual toast going on over the weekend. People using hashtags, to Roger, and sharing great memories about the guy, and it became a community. And we saw in a different way a similar thing with Boston.
I'm cutting up only because we only got 1 minute left, and we haven't even mentioned the fact that Twitter got hijacked with AP, and boy, did that get everybody's underwear in a bunch for a while there. And yesterday there were a lot of very thoughtful people in the media calling for Twitter to sort of come to the table with a solution to this, like a double password or some kind of arrangement.
But also the financial.
We get just a little bit of time.
Okay,
Go
the
ahead.
financial thing was algorithms too. I mean, if you set up your trading to go on the word bomb and White House, it's not going to matter what Twitter does, and that's a problem in that financial industry.
The Twitter being hackable is a problem.
Absolutely, and I will say the one thing I got a kick out of was some people said, well, I didn't quite believe it because it didn't match the exact AP style that their tweets usually have.
But the algorithm didn't know that. The financial trading algorithm would still go bingo.
And neither did a lot of people
who just accepted it.
Heart failure.
Yeah, that's a huge problem,
Yeah, we got a lot of these kind of huge problems.
Yeah.
And good luck to the Koch brothers when they buy their Tribune, right? Because they're going to inherit all of these problems.
Rupert Murdoch isn't a threat enough.
Yeah. Okay, got to go. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did, and it's always fun to talk about the media. Love to do it. Marcus Gilmer, Sun-Times. Thank you. Barb Iverson, Columbia College. Thank you so much for being here today. You've been watching Chicago Newsroom. It's a service of CAN TV, and if you go to this little thing right here, this little address, you can watch us any old time you like, and you can subscribe on iTunes. We've just talked about media. We'll stop. Check us out there, and we'll see you next week here on Chicago Newsroom. Thanks. Bye. After all that, I was 9 seconds early.